Welcome. This is my newest baby. It was actually giving birth last Tuesday. It was in my mind for a while, and then ET was a good motivation of actually now completing the slide deck for today's show. So you are my prototype audience, first time ever, work for me or whatever, with that special topic. And to actually commit suicide officially on ETE, I brought with me the most boring topic available, which deals with Active Directory fundamental authentication purposes around Office 365. So I want to talk about pretty much about the relationship between on-premises authentication and off-premises cloud authentication. So when the term Office 365 appears on the screen, it's pretty much meaning Active Directory Azure-wise, so Azure AD. And the idea why I thought that could be an interesting portion to just talk about this is thinking about outside of the standard Windows box. There is use cases outside of Windows that relate to the modern environment that is enriched with Office 365 usage. And specifically I want to address that from a perspective talking about Windows versus Linux workloads. If everybody is dealing with EUC workloads right now, there is a certain chance that you have to deal with non-Windows backend stuff that has to be integrated there. And the authentication between your running Windows workload and that backend that you have to attach to might be interesting. Opposite-wise also that backend system, Unix or Linux, whatever-wise, that needs to speak Windows technology might be interfering with things that specifically are becoming a little bit different when you embrace Office 365 on the official agenda. So that's my thinking, what I want to cover today. Pretty much of a nightmare across all the boards. So it's about identity and access management stuff. And this, what I call the side effect of unifying your login schemes to make that more useful to your audience. And it has, to my impression, a certain side effect on how we should talk to users about the way they authenticate to their systems. And in the end, if you talk about that the long road and then go over across all systems, it becomes a Kerber's nightmare, essentially. If you never have deep dived in that, believe me, you will see in the following chapters that there's something coming. Honestly, as this is the version 1 of that deck, this is essentially not a chapter overview, it's more like the red line. I want to showcase certain side effects. The chapters are quite different, but first off, this is my world today. Maybe it's pretty much similar with yours, maybe it's just kind of identical, but that's the way I live in between. So I primarily, as everybody knows, I'm living more like a left-hand side-wise guy. So you won't get away with any out of any of my presentations without being bored with Netscaler technologies, or the same applies today as well. But I want to use Netscaler more like the example candidate of a non-Windows asset in that environment that we are talking about now. So primarily it's about the relationship between user identities in between the middle, so on-premises wise, Active Directory, and right-hand wise, Azure AD as a cloud service operation. Primarily required, for example, in terms of your customers moving to Office 365 for licensing purposes because of the per user versus per device licensing schemes, or using OneDrive there or OneNote or whatever. So there is a small transition into all these other application spaces. And everything that deals with users is in the end an identity play. So identity and access management is something that flows through all this discussion. We have no time at all going through any aspects of what IDAM actually is. So I would at least want to present you 3 major points and 3 major pain points. First one deals with the authentication, so making sure that you know that the user is just the one he pretends to be. The second thing deals with authorization. That is the side effect of now using and making something out of the identity. So when you know there's a certain user talking to a system, what is that user entitled to work on in terms of privileges management and other stuff. And of course, interoperability. That's the thing why I, for example, love my Netscaler stuff, for example, as you have to deal with things when you leave the safe zone called Windows. And before we do that, unfortunately, you need to really start with a fundamentally boring first move, talk about what AD is about. I'm trying to get that chapter done in, I would say, less than 3 minutes. Unfortunately, that's not doable. We need that initial chapter for some kind of vocabulary and to make you familiar with the identity that I use in the other chapters. So speaking about identity, I want to give you an example that everybody in that room should say, "Hell, that's just ugly." It's about the new user creation phase. When you set up a new user in your Active Directory or have that provisioned by your customer, you have two options how to get back that user. First one, user type, is the left-hand one, which is the lazy one. The right-hand side is the complex type. And the difference obviously lies in the details. Before talking about the details, as a first takeaway, because that is furtherwise important for speaking about details, 3 different fields from a query perspective you should be aware of. It's user principal name, it's the classic semi-colon name, it's the email attribute. So that's the thing that is important in terms of dealing with identity and the thing that the user thinks what he actually is, or what he should be when he gets queried for the question, who are you, by the way? And if we compare the lazy guy left-hand wise and the complex guy right-hand wise, it is the difference in between what is the relation between the prefix on the UPN and the stuff that is in the semi-colon names. So for us in the European culture, it has become pretty much natural, from my understanding, from my way I've been working with customers over the last years, that we are pretty much getting a lot into that employee ID thing, right? Personal number, something from HR, or initials thing, or something that is not necessarily related to the natural name of the user, which goes typically in that semi-colon name, right? Everybody in that organization logs in with something that is not naturally himself or herself, but something that he knows that's my user ID. And the user principal name that is along with that is eventually the same or not. So the lazy one, left-hand wise, is the same, right-hand wise is something different. And of course, if you deal with application integration in a given environment, please make sure that customers give you the right-hand sided type. When I've been working with customers about these POC phases and testing and validating solutions, unfortunately you get these type of test accounts that come from elsewhere that don't follow any standard creation phase, no workflow, whatever. And when they come through that non-standard phases, so the lazy-wise version, it is obvious that many admins just use the standard UI, type the names in, and press enter, enter, next, next, next. What happens is that copy-over effect that the UPN and the semicolon have. They're just the same prefix, because that's the way the UI works. However, the left-hand one is simpler to pass by a POC, to pass by a project phase, but reality says the majority of users may look different on the right-hand side. Obviously, when we talk about the comparison between the UPN and the email address space, just I would say a very small percentage of customers really has an official domain name for directories. That .local, .internet, whatever has become pretty much popular. So from a UPN perspective, even on the complex account, the UPN and the email address is not the same in, I would say, 90% of our use cases. And the thing is now discussing how to address that problem. If you have been in an O365 deploy, you know the standard answer to that. You need to align the email address with the UPN. There's no other way around. So for doing that, AD for a long time already has all these capabilities. So you have the discrepancy between your internal name and the option of adding something else to make that happen, that UPN in the end becomes unified and is the email address. So if we move that forward, it is just as a side effect, if you have multi-tenancy customers, multiple directories and trusts and stuff like that, the right-hand portion really becomes ugly, but it's solvable because it's the same UPN across all of them, and that becomes interesting from a domain routing perspective. But once you have that additional UPN there, you go into your account, that's mine now for the further discussion, and you want to unify this account. That means if you have the on-premises perspective of the standard account untouched so far, you have the email address, which is the nice portion, which I perfectly can identify myself. And you start with, for example, the guy previously known as ShareFile with no citrix files. Those guys interact with you on the email address scheme. Pretty natural. The user can answer to that. As long as citrix files is not deeply integrated in your environment, nobody cares. However, if you go to these other guys, they are also in the same way pretty much lazy, asking you for the email address, and that's the reason why I get you that best way recommendation of saying, oh, by the way, each time we ask about the email address, that's actually not the truth. We want to make sure that you internally map this to your user principal name. So in the end, the only way out is just follow that standard best practice and making sure that the email address becomes the UPN, and not vice versa, by the way. So that's pretty much a standard procedure. That can be done. That's the best way recommendation to solve the pain. And that's just about doing this. Before doing this, we need to speak about the side effect for those customers that up to date have refrained from doing that. There are still some out that have not passed that specific step, that have still different UPNs for internal purposes and had fear of changing things, because changing things can be quite complex. let me take this specific example. Everything's on screen. You have all my attributes, you have them in the table as well. And for the fundamental understanding why this now becomes different in terms of application integration, I have a question for you guys. If that's my user, and I would be the dumb one asking, hey, how can I log in? And by the way, my standard way of doing that today is the initial way, so the same account and stuff. That's the thing I would typically be made aware of, and I now get a new welcome paper and saying, from the next day on, please use the email address instead. But in general, the speaking is, how many options do I personally, with that account, have to log into a given Windows system? To be sure, I don't want to have the exact answer on what it is, I would just have a number. How many options do I have to log in? Is it just 1, 2, 3, 4 more? Show hands off. If you have these attributes, it's my user account. Do you want to log me in now with that information? I give you my password. How many ways do you have to just type in and correctly get logged onto the system? Anything for 1, for 2, 3? 3 at least, not bad. 4, 5. Anybody for a number? 4? Not bad. Okay. First one, obviously, it's the semicolon. Will work just by default. Nothing surprisingly at that point. Of course, the more accurate version would be prepending the domain name, so it's technically different. So if you previously treated the number as 2, that would be your tree answer in that case. That's okay. That's just for the bullshit phase of the presentation, but it's actually not the same from a processing perspective, because it depends on what the backend does with the short name instead of the qualified name. That's actually a difference. And the, oops. That's not necessarily me. I'm still there. The presentation has switched. Let's do that here. Okay, so we were kind of like here and there. That's okay. So the third one obviously is the UPN. Okay, I think majority of you all guys is fine with that. So give me some time why there's a fourth, and give me more time why there's a fifth one. Just as a takeaway, right? We have 5 of them. My personal thesis is, in today's world, working with customers, that UPN is pretty much not used on a Windows system for logging into that environment, because everybody adheres to that employee ID thing. Well, as you could do. Second thesis, by the way, there are exceptions. Honestly, there are some customers that are more aware of the fact that the UPN is required. I'll give you some examples later, so please hold back that the thesis might not be completely accurate. Second thing, that's what I'm saying. You use that standard SSO for the backend. So regardless of what you typed in Windows, anything that ties to backend authentication purposes is primarily designed and tested with the same account name and nothing else. Nobody actually spent the time of trying to log into a backend system with a UPN, especially when you have some kind of concentrators in front of that, the VPN or whatever, that have to do backend authentication on your behalf. The majority doesn't do that with anything else than SSOing with the same account name. And of course, exceptions apply. If you're a fan of FAS, you are already aware that UPN becomes critically important to do that. If you have a multi-tenancy Active Directory, you have no other way around, because the complexity of prepending the right name, domain prefixes is just cumbersome, whereas the UPN just solves all the pain. Third one, which is my hope, by the end of that show, you will like the UPN story more than ever, right? We'll see if that can get you there or not, but that's just the boring entry of that. So in the end, the thesis is switch your users to a UPN-based login scheme. So why not? And the question why not brings up the danger and the side effect, do I break something? If I have a running environment with existing users that I just create the new naming scheme in the backend and don't tell everybody, that's pretty much good. That just can work. If I now officially go out to my users and tell them that the email address from the next day on is an official supported login method, what does break? First picture, I think that's pretty much standard for everybody. You have all the working things like 365 services, you have the connector that syncs all that stuff for the Mac, and you have your both LAN-side access and remote access to those systems. That's pretty much a diagram you may have seen with any of my other Netscaler sessions over the last years, because that's just standard stuff. The thing is, and that's my focus for today, how about this hybrid login, because you have existing users that you didn't have send the newsletters that you have changed something, that use the old scheme, and the other users that have the welcome letter, by the way, by tomorrow, use the email address everywhere. That's the reason why I call these hybrid login. You have then either or possibility, because Windows takes 5 of them anyway, whereas you 3 at least now. other fourth and fifth to come later. But that's the thing. So if you use that, what does it break if you just officially start using email addresses everywhere in the system? So it's about the front-end authentication. So supporting that side by side. The Windows OS is pretty much tolerant to pretty much everything to that. You just get the login. However, you have a EUC session. It's a Windows workload that now has eventually a side effect of that if the users use that differently. The interesting portion is that from anything inside of environment perspective and scripting and variables and all that stuff, even the user profile itself, internally still works in the same way. So regardless if you type the UPN or not, your user profile still is based on the same account name principle. Regardless if it's an existing one, that does not change anyway, because it's SID related, but even if it's a new user, it's still same account name based. All your environment scripts, login scripts, environment managers, all that stuff, they will report you back the same account name, which is kind of ugly because the users log in differently than the reporting system will tell you. But at least it was working. The other side effect that Windows by itself is not completely consistent what it actually does. So there are some small portions where the user can verify that he actually is on the way with the UPN. However, it has, to my understanding and my research so far, no technical side effect. I'm open to a discussion and findings if that may be different. And to be honest, I don't care about anything older than these guys. So the older systems, especially on the portion of environment variables, were pretty much different in how they reacted because of that things like user domain name, username, user DNS name, all these environment variables you're aware of. In an older Windows world, that may look still a little bit different. So of the modern Windows, we're pretty much in good shape. The older ones may be in trouble, so better check them out. Some specialized use cases exist where that switch from same account name to UPN will cause you trouble. Because something might be in place today that already uses the UPN, eventually not officially, but with something that the user requires on a daily basis, so that overlooked relevance, which pretty much done it, the smart cards that are already rolled out to the user with an old naming scheme. They have a valid UPN there, it's no doubt, but that is no longer the same one which you have on the day next when you have that migration. They will instantly break because nobody recodes the cards. As a side effect, you no longer can log in. So those customers have to be treated differently because it's just like a full outage for all these customers. Second thing, which is typical, which I've seen multiple times, deals with enterprise Wi-Fi with certificate-based authentication, which is available in so many flavors that the answer that it breaks in general is not really true. Accurate is more to say if there is something involved that uses the user identity as part of a certificate in that ongoing authentication phase, that guy is about to break. So those guys that have just Wi-Fi only may have a relevant problem of getting the new certificates loaded on their systems via GPO. So maybe some of these users for a while have to use their docking station with Ethernet cabling to get back the right provisioning. Otherwise they are screwed. And the same also applies to the smartphone world, where typically that ownership is not based on the device, but instead of the user where the device is enrolled to. So if you again switch the UPN and directory, the already enrolled devices have something different on their local asset, which doesn't change automatically. So take care about these things. It breaks running environments like crazy because you enter the UPN. Just the result of that. So make sure that if that is something in production, do that more batch-wise, more department-wise, because otherwise you get pretty much famous in that company. So with that being said, the takeaway is Windows is pretty much solid. However, the non-Windows tier becomes interesting. So let's switch that over. And as I was saying, my non-Windows tier obviously deals around with NetScaler stuff. So that standard login scheme, the mask get to display to the outside world, in terms of gateway login, that's the most relevant use case I think that comes to mind. Now you could support there that you have both the SAM account and the UPN side by side. It's pretty much not rocket science. However, you have an existing login mask out which has some descriptive meaning. There's something labeled, type in your username, whatever. You need to think that all these labels have to be rethought because it should look like type your username or mail, or maybe you want to prefix that now officially saying now please enter your email to have the officially switch communicated to the users. So you need to think about the usability and the awareness of users. On the one hand, giving them a welcome letter, by the way, next morning the email is the way to go, and all the other systems where you interact with, still have these ugly types like enter SM account name or user ID, whatever. So make sure that this relates to the timeline, how you interact with your users on that portion. So make sure that that kind of adjustment happens to all these UIs, which is just like homework. That's not rocket science. What's also not rocket science is just having the existing authentication policies added with an alternate one. So the first one querying for the same account name, just to make sure that those users that have not been made familiar with the change still can log in. And the other guys that know about the change have a chance to log in, because that UPN by default is not queried, right? So it's the way how you can easily support that hybrid login side by side, just add another policy. That just works on any given standard deploy of Netscaler. Nothing special so far. And it supports classic authentication. However, the downside of that, if you have these probing mechanism of taking the one and then the other, and you go into diagnostics mode on those systems, those debug logs become harder to read, because the system just attempts to log in with something that is technically invalid, gets a deny, logs something out, hey, that user invalid, takes the next authentication policy, and obviously succeeds. So from a readout perspective, those diagnostic logs become a little bit ugly. And of course, on the backend side, so speaking of the domain, any domain controller receives potentially a bad login attempt for a non-existing user, which still is an event log. So if those systems are under surveillance with any other security system that says, hey, we have something going on Active Directory in terms of an attack, that thing is increasing. So you need to be carefully of doing that just from scratch, because that changes the way log files are created and measured. It becomes even more worse if you have those login schemes that use multi-factor authentication with, for example, the key fob tokens, where you type numbers. Not necessarily every MFA solution is intelligent by themselves, probing these two different naming schemes on their own. They are, for example, have a table in there saying, hey, this is the same account name, that's the associated MFA key fobs, and if I don't have a match there, I have a deny situation. So the user is typing something that is not officially valid in the username field, and from a verification perspective in the directories, especially on the MFA, you're now probing a non-existing user again, which results in a fully denied stage for that user. The solution in the end is thinking about N-factor. N-factor is pretty much popular now on Netscaler for newer builds. I understand that existing environments are harder to convert, but for newer builds, I would highly recommend of doing the login scheme using N-factor, because N-factor has the way of taking username and translating that into something meaningful and sending the right user ID, if you will, to the respective backend system for verification, and not bloating the log files and the authentication system with waste. So if you think about that visually, I think that's easier to understand. We have the standard thing that's unfortunately a problem with the projection. It is hard to read. What you can do within your LDAP authentication, or better to say LDAP enumeration, you can take all the interesting attributes from the user. You need them at some point later on anyway, so just collect in SIM account name, collect in user, principal name, other stuff like that. And once you have these attributes as part of the ongoing authentication phase, you can use them later on. It's also hard to read, I guess, maybe. Okay, you got the slides there on anyway. I can pick up that specific value, and for example, say if I go to my radius on backend, I take the third attribute, for example, which could be the same account name. If I go to my directory, I take the UPN instead, and so you have a pretty much perfect mapping. So it is regardless of what the user types, because it comes from there, left-hand wise, upper wise, you enter the name, and you have these non-authentication phase. You just enumerate that user ID, try to find the user. That doesn't create a log on a domain controller. Just finding a non-existing user is pretty much silent. There's no authentication happening. And depending if you either find it based on a SAM account name input or based on a UPN query, so you take that what the user has typed and validate this either against the attribute SAM account or on the attribute UPN. In both of these scenarios, you end up in the next authentication step. And then you know that that radius guy, for example, cannot work with anything else than just the SAM account name, so give them the SAM account name. And the next guy could be LDAP, give them the UPN, and that way you're through. Pretty much standard stuff. We're familiar with N-factor, that's just working. So the trick is that first cascade of that if-then phase doesn't leave behind a log side effect on your domain controllers. So backend. Now the user is in, think about what the backend does. On the backend you can also can choose between same account name based SSO or UPN based SSO. And there's nothing in general perfect. Both of them have advantages and disadvantages. I would highly think about using the UPN because it has better flexibility in terms of multi-tenancy and other side effects. However, I know that the majority of backend systems, that's actually really not me. There's something here with the beer. It's a beer. Luckily. Okay. A lot of backend systems don't expect that way of authentication. So you will find a lot of administrators that ask, hey, why using that? You need to come in a dialogue with them. Why now the UPN is the new master scheme for the company? What is interesting, specifically within love for a nice little guy called Storefront, Storefront has a feature of limited domains. It's called restricted domains or trusted domains, it's official wording. By default, there would be the classic NT name in there. What you now need to do, if you now align the UPN phase in there, you need to make sure that Storefront accepts that as another domain name. Because from a Storefront perspective, it's just an ASCII character comparison. They have no clue about that name, which is an email address, which is a completely different namespace, in the end maps to a user that is coming from any of these allowed domains that's coming later. That's just an ASCII stuff, so you need to add that, otherwise you get a non-existing user scenario and of course get denied login for that. Same happens if you do not prefix anything, then we get that problem that user cannot log anymore, so you need to play around with that feature set that makes life easy for you. There's also a bug in Storefront in the latest release where the corresponding log entry says the presented domain where the XYZ now should be in is simply not populated, so it's saying the user domain is not presented, and the important thing to read is simply not in the logs. That's just an ugly side effect where they forgot to put the priorities in there. But you see kind of this log file if there's a misconception between UPN and Roland.
Is that 315 or 314?
18, from the 18 disk. I don't know the number by myself, that was taken from the latest disk, so the current release.
350.
Yeah. So a little more on speed. How about if you now have your gateway policies, especially if they come from wizard-based thing, then you may know that there is that so-called single sign-on domain. If that is configured and you use the same account name, everything will work like a charm. If you now switch to the UPN-based version, I can guarantee you by 100% that nothing will work. So go in your config and get rid of that parameter at all. If you like to have that prefixing, use that on a per user, per Google, per scenario based binding, but not globally, not per virtual server. Get rid of that parameter, so either use the running config for anti-domain or go through the UI because of that problem. If you come in there with the right hand guy, anti-domain does exactly what it was intended for. You get a grant. If you go the left-hand wise, so the UPN style, it overrides the domain suffix. And that obviously leads to a non-existing user. That is not the 6 scheme, that's the non-existing user in that case. So make sure they get rid of that. And if you're using Unified Gateway, make sure that those anti-domain sits both in the gateway policy tier and in the AAA ATM tier. That's completely independent of itself. Maybe you have copied over because of historical reasons, blank them both. And the problem comes with the fact that you cannot unset that policy. So the idea of binding policies on gateway is binding something and eventually overriding that at a later stage, depending on the priorities. There's no way with a higher priority to unset a specific attribute. That's just not the way the gateway policy engine works like. So blank that at global level. And you're good to go. So with all that things, we are open to open the door to hell and talking about what happens on the Kerberos train, because there is a fundamental change. What I want to talk about is that protocol transition thing. You have something that is natural Windows and that now has to speak something non-Windows or the opposite way around. So because it's easier to start with, I want to start with inbound Kerberos. So any backend resource that is a non-Windows, Linux, whatever system that presents resources to your users where authentication shall happen. That's not necessarily Netscaler. While using Netscaler for the examples, can be anything in the company that is based on Linux and that offers Kerberos-based integration, and that exactly just breaks on day one after you switched all your users. not to UPN login, but at the fact where you have changed the naming scheme. Just regardless how the users log in, it just breaks on the day where you change the naming scheme to being unified. So if you want to have examples for that, I'm running around with examples for years now. My personal reference for that is the identity provider thing, where you have something in between that takes users for authentication purposes silently and does something in terms of functionality. The thing is, you need to differentiate what authentication and what authorization actually is. The authentication phase means, on a product perspective, the user must negotiate the identity with Windows standard technology. That's just happening. For that, you need a Kerberos delegated account that has the name. That's not rocket science. It's just how you make a non-Windows member part of your Active Directory. You need a DNS record pointing to that. CNAMEs will not work. It has to be an A record. That's just standard stuff on Kerberos. Same as the 5-minute drift. That's just Windows worldwide. Firewall rules, so nothing surprisingly at that point. The trick kicks in when the authorization phase comes in. So the user has authenticated. You now have the user ID. And now want to make sure that you know the groups, know the attributes, certain more of the user to decide what to do with that logged in session. And there, you need a special treating. Give me a picture for that, that's easier. So a lot of stuff here. The interesting portion, I have my directory right-hand wise on the lower end. I have the same user on the left-hand side in Office 365. And I want to get outside to that, let's say, OneDrive, or whatever. And I don't want to be nagged with authentication. So in between, there must be some engine that authenticates me silently and sends me out to the 365. So from a logic perspective, I want to be authenticated here. I want this guy to pick up my identity from Active Directory, to pick the relevant attributes so that the federated login to 365 and Azure AD is being available. And with that, I want to be sent over there. That's pretty much standard diagramming. The problem is, at that point, well, by the way, any other thing will apply, so the SaaS thing, it doesn't matter, it's 365 or anything else, it's logging into the outside world with more than just a name. The thing is, that way from step 1 to step 2 is the critical one, because you have the negotiate on that skill, as an example. Now you want to find the user. For an ugly reason, that is critical. If you now remember, my username on the right upper screen is already aligned, so it's my email address as the UPN. It has the same account name underneath. And the most shocking thing is, it is regardless if I used that account based on SAM account or on UPN. In both cases, I have the same problem, which is the unexpected result as well. So from a timing perspective and rollout, that's really the hard one. So here, that's the unexpected surprise. That brings us back to that stage. We had that diagram a few minutes ago. Of course, it's about what is the UPN thing. Another guess for you guys, what's the user principal name on that screen here? Some thoughts? Actually, it's just reading. It's this guy here. The thing is, that is so-called explicit UPN. It's just reading, taking, everything is fine. However, there's another hidden candidate which is used by Kerberos, which is the IUPN, the implicit UPN. Unfortunately, this guy has a naming scheme that you cannot influence, which is hard-coded to the main. And this is essentially a username, which is, by the way, our fourth candidate from the previous question. So Kerberos has no clue about all this UPN stuff. So regardless of what you do with the UPNs, and regardless how far you align them with an email address name scheme, the technical IUPN that is used internally across all Windows systems is based on that naming scheme. So it's also interesting that that same account name, which everybody, me including up for a while, has treated being the legacy inheritance of Windows NT4 or 3.5 or whatever, is still the main candidate for creating user identities in Windows, including Server 16 and Server 19. Hasn't changed. So the same account name itself is not legacy. The prefix, the BIOS thing, that's for sure legacy stuff. The same account is there to stay forever, it's my impression. And that also explains why on Windows 10, for example, the usable variables, the profile path, all that stuff, is still based on same account name, regardless of what you type as a UPN. Windows internally does same account name stuff. And that maybe explains why I'm also interested in getting complex user accounts for testing. Because the lazy guy can be made work, even in a Kerberos environment. Thanks for that. For example, with the anti-domain parameters, because you can oversteer a lot of things in the system. Once you have reached the complex account types, you have to deal with naming schemes. You need to know what the Active Directory looks like and to have that face done right. So here, let me give you a picture of that. That's essentially the thing that happens. You have the negotiate, which is just silent, it just happens. And then you have the group enumeration. And if you want to enumerate that user, you cannot use the string that you get from negotiate, because the string you get from negotiate is nothing that matches to an LDAP attribute in Active Directory. Because in Active Directory you have the explicit UPN, and the explicit UPN is something different. The implicit UPN, however, is not even an attribute. So your LDAP query comes to a sudden end, unless you use N-factor and oversteer the way the identity is actually used. So you have to strip off that add domain name stuff, because what you get back is a SAM account name. Probing a SAM account name shouldn't be rocket science. And the also interesting thing, the negotiate action on Netscaler is successfully passed. What you fail in is getting the right groups for that user afterwards, or getting additional attributes. So if you would just have to do negotiate, you wouldn't even learn that there's a difference. However, if you want to do something to that user in terms of authorization, granting access, denying access, doing something, you need all these attributes, so it's absolutely critical to get the LDAP done right. Even more complex, if you have environments where you have MacBooks in that area, which officially cannot do Kerberos, you need to support NTLM. It becomes a little more critical to make sure that you have all the versions available to query the user, either on that what has been typed, what has been sent to you, or based on the, no, not again. Realize what was typed there to make sure that this is working. So up to a demo to understand what's going in here. To get familiar with the way how my demos are created, I use the background color to get you in the mood if it is an admin session or user session. So the admin has a red screen background, the user has a blue screen background. That's the concept behind. So starting with the admin experience, that's my user account. It is not, which has not been unified so far. So SAM account name and the standard UPN is just the same. So the user just logs into a Windows system. For speeding up the process, I'm not even using a functionality, I'm just using a Netscaler diagnostics page that shows me I have successfully authenticated the user and doing nothing else beside of that. So it shows me my name, has groups, has something that is required for Azure AD. Typically something more would happen, just for the purpose of speed. That's just the end phase for the demo. We go back to the admin portion. So now we unify my user so that the email address takes place. And the assumption would be that I now have an email address available. Unfortunately, when I log into that environment, regardless of SAM account or UPN, it doesn't matter, the negotiate action brings me something different, and my Netscaler is no longer able to enumerate the user, because that IUPN has no match in Active Directory. Even if Windows tells me that I'm logged in with that guy, LDAP has no clue about that mapping scheme anymore. So all your Linux environments that have to deal with those users have to be made intelligent of stripping that identity into the SAM account name, which I'm doing here right now. So I'm adding a third way of checking user memberships. And when I press refresh on the existing page, by the way, I have this scheme which strips the IUPN domain suffix away, so that I just have the same account name ready for verification purposes. So I can use that as a standard LDAP functionality. And when I go back there and just press refresh, I'm good for work again, because I now have the differentiation. I got something from negotiate, which is an IUPN. I have the intelligence of mapping this to the explicit UPN or the same account name, and I can get all the attributes back in. And if you want to verify that, if you have the K list on any given Windows machine, it shows you your tickets. There you can essentially see that internally in Windows, although I was logged in with the UPN, my existing IUPN, so I was using the explicit UPN for logging in, the implicit UPN is the stuff that is used for Windows authentication internally. So a K list is your friend to verify how Windows is working under the hoods. So that gives me time for the last 5 minutes to see how the opposite way is working, because that's not pretty much different, but requires a different thinking. We're coming from something that is non-Windows password and want to authenticate the user. My primary example, which I typically use, is ActiveSync with certificate-based authentication. So it's the way where you deploy an ActiveSync profile on your smartphones without requiring the user to type anything, which also has a usability aspect. And if you have something that doesn't even have a Windows password and you want to transition into an authenticated user session, obviously Kerberos is the only helper that you have available to actually have access to that Windows backend resources, such as Exchange. So the diagram, before we go there, some pretty much differentiation before. Authentication, we authenticate the user based on certificates, which obviously is completely without passwords. The authorization phase is still simple because inside of the certificate, the explicit UPN is in there, and the explicit UPN is something that's part of an LF query. That's pretty much forward. However, Exchange by itself has no clue about the explicit UPN for authentication purposes. Not on the Kerberos perspective. If you were to just type that interactively, Windows will do all the translations for you. But if you do native Kerberos from the intermediate tier, you need to make sure that that Kerberos token is correct. So specially required. Again, Kerberos requirements, delegation, nothing special. The object name on Netscaler has to be the name of the service. That's ugly, but that's the way how the engine works on the system. Time drift, firewall rules, nothing special. So from a scheming perspective, left-hand wise, it's either a native client, could be secure mail. Both of them have the certificate-based authentication available for simplifying the login. That user has deployed a software certificate carrying my explicit UPN name, which then comes into the Netscaler for authentication, pretty much rock solid. So we can look up the user in directory, because there's a perfect match, nothing rocket science. However, on the way to Exchange, where we need a delegated ticket, we need to make sure that at that point, that translation from UPN, the explicit UPN, into negotiate, makes sure that the naming scheme is still accurate. So, unfortunately, the built-in engine has no clue about that, so we'll end up in something like this. If you don't prepare the environment for that, the log file looks like just ugly, because it comes to domain name, to service names and usernames that are simply not in the system. And the reason is just that the Kerberos engine on Netscaler just assumes that the suffix that you use for SSO is just matching the domain. So you need to make sure that it matches the domain. That's just the key trick to that. So what you essentially need is a traffic profile that again constructs an implicit UPN so that Exchange becomes happy, or better to say the TG process in domain becomes happy, so that you have a token. And showing is easier than discussing that. So again, seeing is believing. You know, blue is user, red is the admin. So we have the smartphone available. This is an MDM device, has no email attached so far, so blank. It is member of the mobile environment, so you have the capability of deploying stuff on the system. So it's already registered for the purpose of time. So switching to the administrator's perspective in Zen Mobile, we have the device there, we have the properties there, it knows about my name, it has all the things ready to actually provide me with the right certificate, the right information. So there's my email, for example, and stuff like that. That environment is linked to a certificate infrastructure, so PKI is integrated with Zen Mobile, so that this guy can now request a certificate on my behalf and transport that to the device. The Exchange profile, for a long time, already has the capability of not having just user password authentication, but instead carrying a certificate. So we create the certificate request as a device policy in Zen Mobile. And we also create an active sync policy, which uses that certificate as the authentication provider. The shown password on screen is just nothing. It's just shown because the console doesn't have an idea of blanking that there is no password inside. And with that, we can move that to our delivery groups so that that smartphone now receives a certificate, an Exchange account with that certificate-based configuration, and we'll just start working from scratch. So we deploy that config, switch back to the phone. Wait for a few seconds for the refresh, get a new certificate, get an Exchange account, and practically the same second or a few seconds later, emails will just arrive without any further user interactivity, because it's just headless. Certificate just works, anything else is done in the backend, so the Netscaler transitions my identity to Kerberos and does authentication to my Exchange inbox. What's also good with the newer iOS builds, I think 11, whatever has that been, they also now start blanking the password in the UI, which has not been the case in earlier iOSs. So that's also cool. So that's okay. So recap. Still awake? We need to collect that in. I have the first 3 on screen. Anybody in for the 4th one? What's the 4th authentication scheme for that user? UPN. Thank you. Where was the IBN? Who's been there? Come later here. We have some sweeties for that. Where's the Kerberos? I think so. Right. So it's the explicit UPN. It's the thing. Sorry, it's the the UPN was on screen. The IUPN is the fourth one, which you get from AD. The fifth one, that's really an interesting thing because you've. Sorry?
DNS / standard conf name.
Perfect.
That's crazy.
That's totally crazy. This guy is also working. I have 5 versions of logging the same user on a given system. All they are working, and all these things could be presented from a given user, and you will get a valid login. And if you want to integrate with non-Windows backend, you need to make sure that all these 5 candidates are working. So, takeaways. I would say on native Windows, it's pretty much the rules work. No more worries I'm aware of. So all the customers we have worked with so far are still pretty much in good shape, except for the small side effects like the Wi-Fi stuff and smart card stuff. That's things where you need to take care about when you move. But in the end, the majority is just okay. This is also done. Non-native Windows devices, it's okay, but you require special handling. Because the majority of them has never been designed in that way. The majority of Linux authentication stacks was not made in mind with the fact that ID unification based on email address schemes that leaves the Active Directory naming scheme is a standard procedure nowadays. And of course, the backend systems is also an interesting perspective. The backend systems, in the majority of use cases, have not been tested at all for UPN-based login, which I still would encourage because it saves your lives in general of saying I have something that works on a workstation, why shouldn't that work on a given backend resource? So just make sure you put some time in that. So with that, I would say you can do that. It requires configuration. As usual, my config examples from those presentations are nothing more like ASCII, so you find them on my GitHub. If you're interested in getting some samples how you actually do that, don't want to scratch that out from the individual slide decks. It's just there. And with that, my timer says that Q&A doesn't make any sense at all. But I'm still here around, so with that I want to say thank you very much to get out here in time for the next presenter. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.